Jamie, very good afternoon to you. How you doing?
Yeah, good afternoon, Mike. Enjoying your kind of strike calendar. Reminds me of shortage of the day. But there's one thing you've missed this week, though, is because the wind's been on strike. We've had a bit of a wind drought.
We have. You're absolutely right. Yeah, which has meant that we've had to fire up the old coal-fired power stations, which I'm rather pleased about, actually. I mean, you could completely rejuvenate the economy of this country if you reopened some coal mines.
It was looking a lot better back in the 80s when we had all this coal. It was a lot warmer then as well, Mike. And ironically, the Welsh Government have come out this week, Mike, and said that they're going to look at their own state-owned wind farms to try and bring energy bills down. And now in 2050, when we have the next wind drought, God knows how we're going to warm up winter. Who knows?
Well, remember they tried to put that wave power into Swansea, and that didn't work very well either.
And that's actually not too bad an idea if you get it working. But Theresa May kind of killed the idea off because of the cost at the time, but it's probably a cheap way of getting your electric now. But yeah, I think you won't be short of people for planks of the week this week, Mike, I think, when you're doing the filming.
Exactly right. So should we kick off with the interest rates? Because obviously, I know we're going to talk about nursing strikes and we're going to talk about some facts and figures that you've got for us on the NHS and all of that, which is all fascinating. But the latest news, breaking news, 3.5% now the interest rate's running at. I mean, it doesn't seem that long ago that it was like 0.5%. It's suddenly gone this accelerated rise, and it's going to hurt people, isn't it?
No, I think one of your kind of listeners was just messaging in a bit confused of what's going on. Remember, we had the big financial crash, 2008-9, so interest rates kind of came down to try and stimulate the economy. Now, I think most of the economists, even the politicians, are accepting that we're pretty much in a recession already. We haven't gone into a technical recession, which is where you have 2 quarters of negative growth, but we're heading in that direction. And what you would normally do there, Mike, is try and get more money in people's pockets to try and spend. But basically, this isn't really the Bank of England running monetary policy. This is the US. So yesterday, the Fed in the US increased interest rates there by 0.5%. If we don't follow, what you will then get, a bit like what we saw with Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, is the value of the pound will go down because people will invest in dollars because the interest rates have gone up there. So this is partly in response to what we're seeing over there. But interest rates, Mike, they're probably not going to go up too much more, is what people are predicting. Inflation will start coming down. We probably peaked already now, Mike, and if you look at the OBR forecast, it's coming down. Remember what inflation is, Mike. It's the annual change in prices. So if you think back, it was where we saw all the petrol prices going up really high kind of last winter. Well, if you compare what we're seeing now, the prices are starting to come down. And when you get the energy prices compared to, say, a year earlier, when we go further on into 2023, they won't be as high, the increases next year as they are this year. So inflation will start coming down. Jeremy Hunt says that they have policies to deal with inflation. I don't think the government needs any policy to deal with inflation, Mike. It's the way the numbers work. It automatically come down.
No, exactly right. Let's talk about the NHS and the striking workers in particular today. I mean, my sense is, and I don't know whether there's any way of checking on this, that the talk of sort of 50,000 to 70,000 nurses being out on strike, some figures even as high as 100,000. I don't know if that's true because an awful lot of hospitals are not striking at all, and an awful lot of picket lines seem very sparsely populated from what we can see. So what do you make of that?
Well, they say they could be up to 100,000. So how many people will actually be on the picket lines is one thing. You'll get some people who may just stay at home, and when you get strikes, not everybody will kind of stand around. Mike, you're right, though. It's important to point out that this isn't a kind of a uniform strike across the whole of the country. You know, many trusts have decided not to strike. In Wales, you've got 4 of the 5 health boards are striking, so there's one that's not. So this isn't a kind of an action that the unions are trying to bring in that is uniform across the country. And a couple of things that they're saying, obviously, Mike, is that working conditions need to be sorted. Well, we are getting more nurses and midwives into the system. We've got 32,000 more full-time over the last 3 years. We've also had a pandemic at the same time. So people are happy to come in and work for the salaries that are currently on offer. I think what's on the screen, if you listen on the radio, is just the chart showing that we are seeing this increase. But we still have 39,000 vacancies, Mike, and I think if you did give that pay rise to nurses, which is talking about 19%, the issue you've got is if you apply that across the whole of the health system, because 46% of the budget goes on wages, that could cost £10 billion. Right. Now, 19% does seem a bit obscene, especially when the private sector, Mike, if you look at wage growth there, is running at about 6.7% at the moment.
Exactly right. And if you look at the number of vacancies, 39,000 you say they still have, in terms of the size of the organisation, as a percentage, that's not actually that high, is it?
Well, it's about 10% when you're only looking at nurses and kind of midwives overall. But in terms of the whole NHS, obviously, there's a load more staff that are kind of in more managerial, clerical roles as well. but it's been kind of stagnant around 39,000, Mike, but people are coming in. The problem you've got is if you go back 10, 20 years ago, you know, the requirement to become a nurse was a lot less. You didn't need to have a degree. Maybe they need to look at kind of the entry requirements for a nurse, because people often blame Brexit, don't they? And they say, oh, well, Brexit's to blame because people went home and things. You know, relying on foreign workers isn't a good thing as well. And not from a kind of we don't want foreigners working in the NHS. The NHS relies on a lot of foreigners.
But there's an awful lot of foreigners working. But there are a lot of foreigners working in the NHS. I mean, it's another myth that they purport to tell us about, right? Because an awful lot of the militant people actually in the NHS happen to be coming from European countries. No particular big deal about that. It just so happens to be the case. The end result is that 5 million people who were from European Union countries asked for permission to stay in this country. So the idea that they all left because of Brexit is a complete nonsense.
No, I think so, Mike. But the big issue as well is, though, if you kind of import healthcare workers from other countries, well, what are the other countries going to work with? Because they need healthcare workers as well. It's not a very kind of way of doing it in terms of how you kind of bring in more people. And the strike today, Mike, they're saying that they aren't going to affect emergency care, but you know, what you can see is waiting lists are up to 7.2 million. We've seen excess deaths for the last 30 weeks. You know, we've seen waiting lists for kind of heart treatment going through the roof as well. And you know, there's more and more people. And the thing is, you look at England and Wales now, it's much, much worse in Wales. So this could, you know, people are talking about Keir Starmer coming in and fixing the NHS. If you look at waiting lists in Wales, Mike, you go 1 in 4 have been on a waiting list for over a year. It's 1 in 20 in England. And if you look at over 2 years, well, 8% of people on waiting lists in Wales now, Mike, have been on the waiting list for over 2 years. And it's practically zero in England. So, you know, the thought that Keir Starmer's going to win the next election and fix the NHS is laughable. And I hear Wes Streeting keep going on about it, and he inconveniently forgets to say what is going over the border where I live in Wales, Mike.
Well, exactly right. And also, I think Rishi Sunak mentioned it yesterday in Prime Minister's Questions. He said, you know, let's have a look at the way the NHS is run in Wales by the dreaded Mark Drakeford. But you make the other point as well today, in that this strike action, which they've said will continue into January, and there will be longer strikes and perhaps more 2-day strikes instead of just one-offs, this will make the waiting list grow. It's not going to shrink them, is it?
It's going to make them grow, Mike, and ultimately people will die because of these strikes. It may not be somebody who, because, you know, you go in for that kind of treatment today, you might get it if you've got an emergency treatment, but over the longer term, waiting list will die. There's a story, my shocking story, but I say shocking. It seems to be a reoccurring story that we see all the time. Over here in Wales now on the weekend, we had an 89-year-old granddad. He fell over, broke his hip and his shoulder. Couldn't get an ambulance. So his granddaughter had to strap him to a plank in the back of her van to get him to the hospital. And, you know, the ambulance trust has come out and apologised for that. You can't really potentially blame the ambulances because you've got backlogs in the whole system. But you've been saying this morning, Mike, you've been saying it for years, you do need to look at it from the GP surgery, from the entry to the NHS, all the way through to social care. Just the thought that nurses going on strike and giving them a pay rise is going to fix things is laughable.
Yeah, of course it's not going to work. It's absolutely utterly ridiculous. But at the end of the day, you know, I don't believe that in any of the current strikes are actually being done with a view to improving conditions for the workers, getting more money for the workers. They're purely and simply a show of force by the left-wing extremists within those particular unions. And they're not interested in making a settlement with the government. They're only interested in causing a problem and hoping to force this government into an early election.
No, I think so, Mike. But they're not going to have an early election. If that's what their plan is, Sunak and Hunt are going to sit this out, Mike, because as I said earlier on, inflation will naturally come down over the next year. So we'll probably go into the next election with inflation down. And I think, Mike, that's probably why the government aren't really backing down on these strikes, because if you, by the time you get to March, April, May time, when inflation's come down to, say, 6, then 5, then it go down to 4%, they'll be saying, well, actually, you know, these pay demands that you want, the inflation isn't as much of a problem as what it was. So I think they're playing the long game, the government, and we kind of got this impasse. It's not going to be fixed anytime soon, is it? Yeah,
I mean, I don't think it is, and I said this earlier, I think the government are making the right decision here, but I'm sort of less likely to think that they planned it. And it's just sort of happened to them, and they've got lucky because the interest rates have started coming down. I don't think there's anything that they've actually done, but they could prove me wrong. You know, they might be this Rishi Sunak emerges in the spring as this incredibly brilliant steward of the economy.
Well, who knows, Mike? You know, I'm a bit.
You haven't got any stats on that.
Yeah, indeed. I think, Mike, I'd rather have Rishi Sunak on strike and Jeremy Hunt on strike, though, than all these workers. You know.
Yeah.
Much better.
Yeah, that's not a bad thought. Well done. Jamie, thank you very much indeed.